to share all of his truth and the reasons for all things with his children, including what we can expect from him and what we cannot expect from him.
David, it sounds like what your father is saying is that God is not going to intervene in things that we can fix. Do I have that right?
Yeah, he is not nearly as concerned about is God just as he is about are human beings just. And I think wants to lay the problems that we typically talk about when we talk about this topic at our feet. That is, rather than turn and say, why are these bad things happening, look to ourselves and say, what can we do about it?
Well, there are obviously some bad things that we can't do anything about. Bishop,
that's true.
Spong, you were telling me last night that your first wife died of cancer. My mother just recently died of cancer. That to me is not just. My mother was a wonderful person. She shouldn't have died that way.
Well, I think that's true, but everybody's going to die sometime. You know, 1 out of every 1 dies. When you hear people say, you know, 1 out of 4 dies with heart disease, the implication is the other 3 don't die, but they all die. Death is a part of life, and we need to welcome it into life and not think of it as something evil that's been imposed upon us, which is part of the myth of Christianity. You know, the Adam and Eve story suggests that death was one of the punishments for sin and not therefore natural to life. I think we've got to rethink that.
Dr. Harris?
Yeah, I agree with that perspective. I think death is a part of life and that the world in which we live is not exempt from suffering. It's a natural part of human existence to expect human life to encounter suffering to the extent that we all must find ways to respond to it, that not so much raise questions about God, but our response to it.
But you know, when you're suffering, someone telling you, well, you know, suffering is just part of life is not really comforting. Yeah, and I think people want to know, how can I make sense of a God who's supposed to be loving and all of the things that are happening in my life that I really don't think I deserve?
I think you've got to begin by defining God. And we live with a definition of God which has been abroad for centuries as a person, a supernatural being, who lives somewhere beyond this world, who has some sense of being directing or having the power to direct the affairs of this world. It's what I would call the theistic definition of God. Now, that is so deeply in our language, so deeply in our minds and hearts, that we believe that if you don't accept that theistic definition, the only alternative is to be an atheist. The language itself sets that dichotomy up. I'm not sure we're accurate when we think about God as a person who thinks and feels and directs the way human beings do. But I think that's inevitable. We human beings always are going to portray God after the highest and best we know, and the highest and best we know is human life. But if horses had gods, they'd probably look like horses.
So what you're saying is possibly God's definition of just isn't the same as ours?
Well, I suspect that if we wanted to define how God thought of God's self, it would have to start from the way we think of ourselves, because we have no way to access that unmediated through human experience. And what we experience in life is death, we experience pain, we experience suffering, and there's no exemption for anyone from that. So we want to try to figure out in a theistic way, giving God responsibility for controlling life. And that, I think, is a fallacy in the way we have a perspective of God. And therefore, people would want to raise the issue of justice and fairness to God rather than to deal squarely with life as it is.
How does a loving God, though, allow and deal with an Adolf Hitler?
Good question. The Jewish people would like to know that too. I know many a Jewish person who gave up all belief in God after the Holocaust because they couldn't put those two things together. Once again, I think you've got to recognize that our definition of God is still an external person. I was trained theologically by a man named Paul Tillich, and he refused to use personal definitions for God, not because God was impersonal, which is what people think immediately when you say we can't use personal words, But he would use words like the ground of all being. He would say that when a person has the courage to be, that they are more in touch with God than at any other time.
The courage to be.
Yes.
Yeah, explain that exactly.
most
We
of-
all be. I
Yeah.
mean, we're here. We.
Yeah, that's right. But being is you know that there are times in your life when you are more alive than at other times.
Usually, when I'm very scared, I feel
Might
more
be.
alive.
It might be when you're very loved, when you feel affirmed, when you feel that your life's value and meaning has become apparent and that things have come together. My sense is that I would like to find a different way to think about God than as a supernatural person in the sky. And when you do, a lot of the problems, like the problem of justice, gets put into a different context. That doesn't mean that we haven't got some responsibility to work for a just world. One of the tragedies of Christianity is that we've allowed injustice to be perpetuated by promising people reward and punishment in the afterlife.
Yeah.
And that simply robs life of meaning here and now.
If we're
But what-
looking ahead, it
Yeah.
takes away what we're doing now.
Right. I think the idea of God as an external supernatural being has fueled a schism between how people think of justice and injustice, rather than having it squarely looked at in the life of people and the way we live it.
And how so?
Yeah, the Adolf Hitler, for an example.
Right.
Why did God allow that to happen, rather than taking the responsibility for how the Hitlers of the world grow up to have a perspective that damages human community, and how that damage is fueled by our thinking and our ideas about how we are and who we are.
Well, then what if we're not going to have this picture of God as this supernatural being who's up there somewhere, and we may or may not get him to help us or not help us, what is another picture, or what is another image of God
Well,
that would work?
That's where it's so very difficult, because we don't have a God language. So all we can do is, by extension of our experience, talk about the divine. All the words we use to talk about God are human words raised to the nth power.
Yeah.
We are mortal, so we say God is immortal. We are limited in knowledge, so we say God is omniscient. We are limited in space, God is omnipresent. They're all human words that we've sort of expanded. My sense is that the less we use words to talk about God, the better we be. As part of me, it's a Quaker, I suppose, at that point, or a mystic. I think that the closer you get to an experience of God, the less any words satisfy that experience. And we need to be open to that possibility.
I think that the language of God is so limited from humorous perspectives that we run up against a wall real quick, because they don't help us get beyond our views in a way that opens up the area of human relations and God in relations to humans. I think process theologians, people who say that God is a relational God, that God is active, involved in the world as we know it, come close to saying accurately that
Is that what you believe?
well, I think it has relevance to the experience that I have had as a person, a black person particularly, ministering in communities of pain and suffering.
You see God here.
It's
working.
God as relational, God as involved in the struggle to define authenticity and relevance as it relates to who we are.
And now you saying where you have human beings like yourself in ministry to other human beings in pain and suffering, then God is there? Is
God,
that a way
I think in the relational, communal connection between human beings struggling to be and understand the best that is in them and to have that lived out, that God is there in a relational sense, so that the suffering that people experience and the pain that people experience is one in which God resonates with and is involved in.
Let's move on to Dr. Dyke's next clip. And this, he seems to be talking about God's limits.